I'm thrilled to know that a woman invented windshield wipers.
Sunny, cloudless, no winds.
I've always been a storm chaser.
They're crazy to do it. In a flash, they were gone.
Their weapon? Snowballs.
Variations of nature affect the course of human history.
The weather. Its effect on us is much more than what's happening outside our windows. From science's greatest discoveries to the creation of nations to the invention of wiper blades, weather events have shaped our lives in every way you can possibly imagine, and in many ways we can't. I'm Harry Connick Jr. Welcome to the 100 Biggest Weather Moments. This list is about more than Mother Nature's most frightening storms. It's filled with events in our past where a change in wind or temperature would have rewritten history books. It's a countdown of weather events that have inspired artists, given life to sports legends, and moved so many of us to tears. Before we continue with the countdown, let's take a look at last hour's list. On to our next moment. 32 degrees Fahrenheit might be the temperature at which water begins to freeze, but for thousands of elite winter athletes, it's the temperature needed so competition can finally begin to heat up. I'm pretty sure flurries weren't in the forecast for the first Olympic Games of ancient Greece, but it was only a matter of time before a man was vying to win, place, or show in events made for cold and cheering on winter miracles.
Only 16 countries participated in the first Winter Olympics in 1924 in Chamonix, France. But it foreshadowed the rising importance of cold weather sports worldwide. An American, Charlie Jutra, won the very first Winter Olympic gold in speed skating. 11-year-old Sonja Henie, who would go on to become a skating legend, winning 3 gold medals, finished last in 1924, but charmed the French crowds. Canada dominated in hockey, winning 4 outdoor matches by a lopsided score of 104-2. An instant success, the games quickly grew in stature, and national pride swelled with athletes' accomplishments.
It's an amazing thing to be able to stand up there, see your flag go up, and know that there's an entire country of people feeling the same pride you are at that moment.
France's national pride soared in 1968 with their handsome triple gold alpine skier Jean-Claude Killy. While in 1984, dazzling figure skater Katharina Witt became the darling of East Germany. But for Americans, the Winter Olympics will forever be linked to one shining moment in 1980, when a game played on ice transformed the nation.
When the U.S. beat the Russians in 1980, it was probably the greatest sports moment in U.S. history. And if we had never had the Winter Olympics, that moment would never have happened.
America had taken some bumps and bruises on the international stage.
We had just gone through Watergate,
held hostage in Iran,
the green jungle hell that was Vietnam.
We needed a victory somewhere.
Everyone expected the Russians to kill the U.S. team.
The Soviet team was, in effect, a professional team.
For them to even have a fighting chance was a big thing, and for them to win.
Do you believe in miracles? Yes! I mean, it's something you'll never forget.
It would be impossible to overstate the sense of pride that engulfed the country when the U.S. hockey team won the Winter Olympics in 1980.
If it's -20, you can drive your car, man. I mean, that's unbelievable.
Driving our cars in all kinds of extreme weather is taken for granted today. However, it wasn't until permanent antifreeze was introduced in the 1930s that America's love affair with the auto became a year-round passion. Before that, drivers in America's cold regions were forced to store their cars for the winter and wait for spring to arrive.
Before antifreeze, the water in a car's radiator would turn to ice. Other solvents had been tried, molasses and honey, but with Fords being attacked by bears all over the place, honey became a real danger.
You couldn't get to a football game in Chicago without antifreeze.
Then they came up with ethylene glycol, which we commonly refer to as antifreeze.
By adding antifreeze to a gasoline or diesel engine, of course, the freezing point of the liquid contained therein is lowered.
Continued improvements have made antifreeze a high-tech miracle that drivers seldom think about.
It is just a set it and forget it kind of a thing, this antifreeze. It's wonderful. You put it in, and your biggest chore is to replace it with new antifreeze.
Whoever invented antifreeze needs just again, this.
It was just a wonderful, wonderful invention to deal with weather.
There's nothing quite like a hobby to take your mind off the stresses of the work week. Some folks enjoy collecting stamps. Others might take in a little bird watching, and there's plenty of people known to take a jog in the park. On the other end of the spectrum, there are a few brave, some might say crazy souls out there who like nothing more than spending their spare moments in hot pursuit of the most dangerous weather phenomenon in the world. Now, before you dismiss these folks, know that these storm chasers are often taking their chances with twisters for reasons that benefit us all.
Probably 60 to 80 mile-an-hour winds here.
People that chase tornadoes have this fascination with weather.
You almost think to yourself, madman.
I've always been a storm chaser. I've always wanted to go out and watch them, and I won't jump in the shelter till the very end.
The majority of people who chase storms are people who do it as a hobby.
Some people like to play golf, some people like to go to the movies. They like weather.
The first storm chaser, as far as I'm concerned, is Roger Jensen. He started chasing tornadoes in 1953, 3 years before I did.
They go out every year during the storm season, the tornado season especially, and chase storms in the central part of the United States.
It's the majesty of the storm, it's the beauty of it, and it's just a compulsion.
It's that instant adrenaline rush. You just never know from one moment to the next what's going to happen.
It sure looks like they're crazy to do it, but we couldn't know what we know about those storms without them.
A lot of chasers who are responsible have shared information from what they've seen out in the field with the National Weather Service so that when they went out to train spotters, they would know what to recognize and what to ignore.
There are people out there that do it for fun, and then there are meteorologists that are out there trying to get information to keep people safe.
One of my colleagues at NOAA developed an instrument along with me that we call TOTO, the Total Tornado Observatory. We put it in the back of a pickup truck, took it down, placed it in the path of tornadoes, got out of the way, and waited for the tornadoes to come by.
There's really no substitute for the kind of on-the-ground, up-close data that we've gathered through scientific storm chasing.
What you see and what you sense and what you can photograph helps to lead you to the truth.
March 18, 1925, the deadliest single tornado in recorded history cut a swath through 3 Midwestern states. The legacy of the infamous tri-state twister can still be felt today.
Oh, the tri-state tornado, that's the benchmark for how bad can a tornado get.
It started down in the Boot Hill of Missouri, that region, went all the way across southern Illinois and into southern Indiana, ending up around the town of Princeton.
It went on for more than 3.5 hours continuously, at least 219 miles, at times up to a mile wide, so low-hanging that it could hardly be recognized as a tornado coming across.
In 1925, tornado watches or forecasts were strictly prohibited. The view of the Weather Bureau at the time was that more harm would be done by panic from the thought of having a tornado approaching than by people taking actions that would save their lives. The first indication of anything unusual happening was this very loud roar, and things began to start disintegrating.
From what I understand, it may have been one of the worst, if not the worst ever. And there's nothing to say that something like that can't happen again.
We'll take a break, but still ahead on this hour of the 100 biggest weather moments.
He didn't break the record, he shattered it.
They were going to do great things, and in a flash, they were gone.
Welcome back to the 100 biggest weather moments. There are plenty of instances on our countdown that feature the age-old grudge match of mankind versus the elements. But up next, we find a rare example of Mother Nature lending an athlete a helping hand with a strong wind at his back. The result was one man's giant leap into history.
Oh, yeah, he said jumped into the next century in Mexico City. Remember it like it was yesterday.
When Bob Beamon, a 22-year-old long jumper from New York, arrived at the 1968 Olympics, he was hoping to achieve his own personal best distance and maybe even win a medal. He knew Mexico City offered the perfect conditions for maximum performance.
You had the thin air of Mexico City.
He was at altitude in Mexico City where the air is thinner, so it's less friction when you jump or run.
Then you had the maximum allowable wind.
You had a tailwind, but it was legal.
With the perfect altitude and the perfect weather, those were definite factors.
Beamon glided down the runway, exploded off the board, and leaped into the stratosphere of sports history.
Usually, track and field records are broken in tiny increments, hundredths of seconds, fractions of an inch. He breaks the existing record by almost 2 feet. No one had ever jumped 28. There'd never been a jump that had 28 in front of it. He takes it from 27.4 and a fraction to 29.2 and a fraction. 29.2 and a fraction, almost 2 feet beyond. I mean, that's just otherworldly.
After the jump, they always look and see where their footmark is, and when he saw that, he looked and almost in disbelief, he basically bent down and started to cry.
He didn't break the record, he shattered it.
The world without windshield wipers, and you're telling me people would drive around like that? What are you, crazy?
When Mary Anderson of Birmingham, Alabama visited New York City in 1903, she noticed when it was snowing, the streetcar drivers stuck their heads outside to see. By the time her ride was finished, she had sketched a drawing for one of the most important weather inventions ever, the windshield wiper.
I'm thrilled to know that a woman invented windshield wipers.
Windshield wipers are literally life-saving devices, so thank God they came along over 100 years ago.
By 1916, manual wipers were standard on American cars. Powered wipers came in 1923, and today, the windshield wiper is a high-tech miracle.
Not only did you need the windshield wipers, but you also needed somebody to invent that blue juice that you squirt on the windshield to kind of clear it off.
Without windshield wipers, how would you get rid of the bugs on your windshield, on the car? That's the question.
I actually like to be tough and not have the windshield wipers going, because there's nothing more funny than when it's barely raining and you see somebody in front of you and their windshield wipers are going.
When you're following the windshield wipers with your eyeballs, that's about the time you need to pull off. Grab a few Z's, you know?
If we could just invent the perfect windshield wiper that when you don't use it very often, like in California, it doesn't stiffen up, because then when you finally have some rain and it misses right in front of your face, there's that spot as you're driving you crazy.
Although it was over 20 years ago, millions of Americans can tell you exactly what they were doing the morning of January 28th, 1986. That's when we learned that one of mankind's greatest technological achievements was vulnerable to something as simple as a Florida frost.
It's just one of the searing things I'll never forget.
We turn on the TV and you see it over and over and over again.
There was just suddenly this electrifying sense that swept through the room.
It was where Americans had just gone up and they were going to do great things, and in a flash, they were gone.
The space program, particularly the manned space program, had been a constant with American pride. And while there had been accidents, when we got to the 1980s, NASA was something that didn't fail.
7, 6. In the winter sky over Cape Canaveral, Florida, freezing winds cracked the fuel tank O-rings of the Space Shuttle Challenger. 73 seconds after liftoff, an entire nation was devastated.
Challenger, go with throttle up. 1 minute, 15 seconds, velocity 2,900 feet per second, altitude.
Trust me when I tell you, the Miami Herald newsroom is tough place, tough as nails. That happened, the place was like a morgue.
It was bitterly cold, far colder than they had ever tested or ever envisioned launching.
People make mistakes, and big organizations, they sometimes make big mistakes.
There was a teacher on board, and not just astronauts who had trained for so many years for this. You feel in a way she was more vulnerable.
It was a sad day for America. It was a sad day for science and technology in America.
And I think it was the first time that we ever really realized, wow, nature is so much more powerful than we are.
It was a gut check for us as a people, as a society, as a nation, of we better be a little careful of hubris.
As they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
I remember walking in and looking at the models and saying, oh my God, what is this?
This was going to be what we call a bomb. It was going to intensify so rapidly that we give them a special name, a bomb, explosive deepening, and that's what happened.
During a 48-hour period in March of 1993, Mother Nature decided to show the eastern third of the U.S., from Alabama to Maine, just how many weapons she has in her arsenal of extreme weather.
It really was a monster. The thing I remember about it is how fast it intensified.
First thing it did is it flooded that coastline with a huge surge, the surge that you'd get in a strong Category 1 hurricane.
Tornado outbreak across Florida.
You had wind and ice storm devastation that put hundreds of thousands of people without power.
Some areas got upwards of 50 inches of snow out of this event. It just buried them in the mountains of the Appalachians.
Our forecaster put blizzard for Atlanta. Blizzard for Atlanta. I don't know whether Atlanta's ever had another blizzard or not.
A massive area was affected, and of course it's a part of the country which is highly populated. So the number of people that were affected by the events from this superstorm was just staggering.
Well, the paradox of these kind of storms is that it's that compacting of the temperatures, the cold and the warm coming together, that allow you to get tornadoes on the warm side and snow on the cold side, and sometimes they're only separated by a few dozen miles.
Coming your way on the 100 biggest weather moments.
I think the majority of people thought this was a damn fool idea.
Weather events have always ranked among the major milestones of history. By 1982, weather was an established staple of daily television news. But would people actually watch a cable channel dedicated to nothing but weather? 25 years later, the answer is a resounding yes. Despite the many skeptics who thought it would fade faster than a summer storm, the Weather Channel has proven to be as powerful as the elements it covers, with often life-saving forecasts.
In 1982, when the Weather Channel launched, there'd been some talk of it before. I think the majority of people thought this was a damn fool idea.
And good evening, America. Welcome to the Weather Channel, the non-ending weather telethon.
Back in the early 80s, Turner was starting CNN, and people were saying, I can understand news 24/7, but weather?
Nobody thought the Weather Channel was going to make it.
I just didn't understand where the audience would be for this. Now, some news doesn't affect some people. Weather affects us all.
What began as a cable TV curiosity now employs over 120 expert meteorologists who get the word out to viewers in over 90 million cable homes, as well as to consumers via cell phone and online at weather.com.
When you have a weather event, that's the go-to place.
You get constant forecasts, updated forecasts that feature stories about what is a tornado, what is a hurricane.
My kids don't ask me if it's going to rain anymore. They'll turn on the Weather Channel and look at the radar for themselves.
If I didn't have the Weather Channel, I would never know how fast I was going to go on the track or what I should wear that day.
One of my favorite parts of the Weather Channel has always been the local on the 8s.
I can't lose a local on the 8s.
I got so sick and tired of waiting every half-hour for the news cycles to finally get to the weather.
The Weather Channel is really important, especially when you're traveling.
Stay in shape for my skiing, I have to be on the treadmill. So I spend a lot of time on the treadmill watching the Weather Channel to see how much snow we're going to get by the time I get there.
Every time I have to fly, I turn to the Weather Channel, and I always try and make them do my kind of weather forecast. Sunny, cloudless, no winds.
Widespread sunshine, though, over the southeast.
So the Weather Channel really helps because it gives you a tremendous amount of advanced information.
It's very important for people just to pay attention to the weather because it can be deadly.
The Weather Channel absolutely saves lives. The more you know, the better off you are.
There's no other place when there's a storm that I'm going to be.
You turn on the Weather Channel over other networks because you feel they're doing this for a living.
You take a beating standing out here, even with a minimal hurricane.
It's become part of the scenery. I mean, it would be odd to go through with your remote and not see the Weather Channel pop up.
Genius in the fact that it certainly did work out and people are glued. And I've got to tell you, more often than not, I'm surfing that.
I can't think of anything more satisfying I've done in my life.
When you look back now, you say, well, of course, it's a great idea. You know, it's weather. It affects everybody.
Sooner or later, you can run, but you can't hide. You're going to the Weather Channel.
Still ahead on this hour of the 100 biggest weather moments.
The itching the throat, the itching the eyes, making funny noises.
Their weapon? Snowballs.
It's time to talk snowballs. Many theories exist on how to make the perfect version of the winter projectile. Some like them big and fluffy, some like them with a little slush. But the ones a group of rowdy Boston colonists tossed at a British regiment back in 1770 must have been those hard, icy kind that hurt when they hit you. Because the little round balls the Brits fired back, they weren't made of snow.
The whole brouhaha between angry colonists and the British authorities was because of a snowball thrown.
On March 5th, 1770, Boston may have looked beautiful, covered in a 1-foot blanket of snow, but the tense relationship between the colonists and the British ruling force was about to turn ugly.
A young Bostonian apprentice to a wig maker began heckling a British sentry, insisting that the British sentry had not paid his barber bill. Eventually, the sentry violently clubbed the young apprentice. Later on, a whole bunch of other wig-making apprentices, and they are a feisty bunch, came back to avenge the beating of their friend. Their weapon? Snowballs.
A snowball was thrown, and basically that's like throwing a rock at the authorities.
By early evening, the crowd had grown to several hundred men, pelting the soldiers with snowballs and ice. The defiant mob, led by escaped slave Crispus Attucks, taunted the British, and soon Attucks was face to face with a nervous soldier. A shot rang out, and Crispus Attucks, dead on the snowy street, would become the first martyr of the Revolution.
The number of dead was in the single digits, not really a massacre, but it was one of the sparks for the War for Independence.
It became this sort of rallying point, a cry for beginning of the liberty movement for the American colonies to start breaking away from Great Britain. So you start realizing that little things in weather can have a big effect. A snowball can turn into the snowball of a revolution.
If you asked me if I wanted a barometer, a thermometer, an anemometer, a sling psychrometer, give me the barometer.
In 1643, Italian scientist Evangelista Torricelli built the first crude mercury barometer to demonstrate that air has weight, a strange idea at the time. Over time, scientists observed a connection between the height of the mercury in a barometer and the weather. The weight of the air, or air pressure, changed when the weather changed. It was a simple concept, high pressure and low pressure, but it forever altered the world of weather forecasting.
Thanks to the barometer, we now know, what weather's going to be like in a few days.
When you look at a weather map, you see large H's and large L's, and these are high and low pressure systems.
Talking to people who know about meteorology, you have one of these real beautiful, bright, clear, perfect days, and I'll say, oh, look up, you can see the big H in the sky.
When a high pressure moves in, when your barometer level goes up, basically, put on a happy face because the good weather's coming, sun, get outside.
Bad weather, rainy, stormy, windy weather is associated with low pressure.
Basically batten down the hatches, your bad weather is moving in.
Sometimes when you have that falling pressure, people feel it, their joints, their knee might ache, and that's the secret that we have at the Weather Channel. We have a room of people with some type of arthritic condition in joints that we turn to when we have big storms coming our way. We say, hey, Bob, how's the knee? Not too bad? Okay, cool. We'll go with a 10% chance of rain.
People just said, enough already. This is not the way our Earth was supposed to look.
20 miles south of Pittsburgh, the city of Donora, Pennsylvania, was a small industrial community of about 14,000 residents in 1948. The townspeople had lived with smokestacks belching out noxious fumes for generations. But when a rising column of warm air created a temperature inversion over the area, it cooked up a witch's brew of toxins in the air. The noxious fumes cast a yellow pallor over Donora for 5 days.
And each day that the smog persisted, more people took sick, more people died.
The air pollution was so bad, and in some cases combined to form a smog so that you could barely see a few feet ahead of you, that people breathing this stuff were dying.
You suddenly say, oh my goodness, we can't live like this anymore, and there's something that needs to be done.
And the community of Donora did just that, spearheading the passage of Pennsylvania's landmark Clean Air Act in 1955. By 1963, Congress had followed suit with a national Clean Air Act.
We got the message across the U.S. and instituted a Clean Air Act.
The public demand for a cleaner environment gathered momentum in 1969 when a shocked nation saw the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland catch on fire due to pollution. 1 year later, Congress created the Environmental Protection Agency to address all pollution issues.
It's so much cleaner now than it was in 1965 because of the creation of the EPA. What we're talking about is kids that don't have asthma. You know, a working mom that doesn't have to take her son or daughter to the emergency room because they're having an asthma attack. We're talking about our health and the health of our kids.
Try telling a Wall Street stockbroker the Dow Jones is just a bunch of digits. Or tell a Vegas bookie the Super Bowl point spread doesn't really matter. The look they'll give you, it's the exact same one an allergy sufferer will shoot your way if you tell them the pollen count is just a number. Because for millions, those digits determine if their day is made or ruined.
Weather has such a huge impact on health. And so when you have something like the pollen count, people rely on that every single day.
The lower Mississippi River Valley, we're seeing some higher grass pollen, if that's what affects you.
1 out of every 5 Americans suffers from the disorder commonly known as hay fever. The main culprit? Pollen. Billions of tiny particles that trees and plants release into the air during the spring, summer, and fall. For people who are highly allergic to pollen, the debilitating symptoms are nothing to sneeze at.
When you wake up in the morning, you're like, oh man, I can't breathe, I can't feel, this is pounding.
I am a girl with allergies, and I'm doing the itching the throat, the itching the eyes, making funny noises that everyone says, what is she doing?
And someone tells you that it's a high allergy day, it reinforces what you already know and allows you to prepare for tomorrow.
Because wind is what carries pollen from place to place, changes in the weather can greatly alter the pollen count in a particular area.
It's like people want to know when they're going to be miserable. That's what it is. At the same time, people then know when they're going to have this relief. It's all about the weather because as an air mass, finally people get so happy when that cold front comes through because it clears out the air and you can breathe again.
To know what the weather is doing, you have to be able to observe the atmosphere. And it wasn't until the radar came along that you could look beyond the horizon.
Radar was actually really developed at the time of World War II to track airplanes, to know where the enemy was. But we realized during and after World War II that we could actually see weather with radars.
Radar is an acronym. It stands for Radio Detection and Ranging. You send out a signal, it bounces off an object, the bounce comes back.
When you see something displayed on these fancy color monitors, you're seeing echo or return from the precipitation particles.
In the mid-1960s, scientists improved radar technology by applying the principles of the Doppler effect. Just as the human ear can detect the high-pitched sound waves of an oncoming train or siren, today's Doppler radars can detect the motion and direction of an approaching storm by seeing the increased frequency of the radio waves. The resulting instrument has given meteorologists unprecedented ability to predict the weather and save lives.
Doppler really shows you the innards of a storm.
That wind speed and direction, whether it's coming towards the radar or away from the radar.
A Doppler radar can tell you if a storm is circulating.
That's huge because that's the first sign of a tornado.
And that has dramatically improved the warning lead time for tornadoes on the average of something like 14 minutes, and the false alarm rate, although somewhat still high, it's really given much more credibility to tornado warnings and really has saved countless lives.
The
The Galveston hurricane in 1900 is the worst disaster in U.S. history from any natural phenomenon in terms of loss of life.
The man who was in charge of predicting the weather miscalculated.
The tragic forecasting mistake of local weather service chief Isaac Klein caused the unsuspecting citizens of Galveston to be totally unprepared when the Category 4 hurricane came ashore at 8 p.m. As the huge storm surge hit, the people were trapped on the 3-mile-wide island with no way to escape.
The storm surge literally just went right across the island.
Caused most of the houses to be completely destroyed.
And virtually swept the island clean in some portions.
The people didn't leave, and so they died.
Somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 died in that hurricane.
They had bodies stacked up like cordwood, and they had controversies, for example, over what to do with all these bodies. We can't give all these people a burial.
One of the things they try to do is weight them down, take them out on barges, and dump them into the Gulf of Mexico. Unfortunately, the next high tide, many of those bodies washed right back on shore.
So they had to then take those bodies and burn those, the ones that were left that floated back in. So it was just a horrible nightmare.
Nowadays, if you go through Galveston, you'll notice there's a giant mammoth seawall that protects the city.
The city of Galveston before the hurricane in 1900 was bigger than the city of Houston. I mean, basically, Houston, Texas exists today because they wanted to get further inland.
We've come a long way since 1900, but we're still extremely vulnerable.
Up next, a decades-long drought rallies musicians to a grand concert for a great cause when the 100 Biggest Weather Moments continues.
100 Biggest Weather Moments brought to you by Nationwide, reminding you that life comes at you fast, so be prepared.
Welcome back. We've all been there. In the airplane, on the runway, the captain comes on the intercom and announces there's going to be a little bit of a delay. Then what do? You sigh, you look at your watch, you roll your eyes, you tap your foot. Finally, the pilot comes back and you hear you've been cleared for takeoff. Well, after learning about our next weather moment, you won't be so aggravated the next time your plane is delayed. Those extra minutes may have just saved your life.
Dr. Fujita is known as Mr. Tornado, but in reality, probably his biggest legacy in terms of public safety has been the microburst.
On June 24, 1975, the crash of Eastern Flight 66 became the worst airline disaster of its time in the United States. From this tragedy, legendary meteorologist Dr. Ted Fujita identified the microburst, a weather discovery that not only solved the cause of past accidents, but also spurred improvements in air safety that are still in use today.
In a microburst, the air comes down, accelerates downward, and then as it hits the ground, it splatters and spreads out like a pancake.
If you are flying an aircraft, you may fly into that spreading column.
When airplanes are flying through a microburst, they experience a particular sequence of events. A false sense of security when they come in one side of the microburst, which increases the flow of air over the wings and causes the airplane to rise. So he's pushing the airplane, nosing it down. Well, when he crosses through the other side of the microburst now, the winds change direction. They come from behind the airplane, which causes the lift of the airplane to go down dramatically.
All of a sudden you have a tailwind, and it's not a good place to be in an airplane.
The moment that the Eastern crash occurred, this was the beginning phases of our understanding of the microburst.
Once it was learned how to detect them, then became one of the greatest stories of technology transition in U.S. history. Every airline pilot is trained twice a year on simulations to avoid microbursts and how to get out of them.
It's like polio. We basically eradicated the threat, and it's really remarkable.
Almost no accidents since then have been caused by microbursts.
The Dust Bowl stands as this classic case of part natural disaster, but part man-made disaster.
The 4 great waves of droughts that hit the plains in the 1930s turned 100 million acres of America's most fertile land into dust. Crops withered, livestock starved, and 250,000 people abandoned their land to seek better lives elsewhere. For a decade, record heat wave and dust storms known as black blizzards haunted America.
The sky would get dark. There was no visibility whatsoever. You couldn't breathe. And I mean, to know that, it's you and your family that are just being sickened by this, and then, your livestock and your crops, your whole livelihood.
We had temperature records which still stand to this day that were broken in July of 1936. 120 degrees in South Dakota. The next day, July 6th, the all-time record set in North Dakota, 121 degrees.
At the same time, if you've got bad farming practices that are removing the vegetation cover and exposing the soil, that's going to cause problems, and especially couple that with high winds, increased winds, and then major drought.
What the drought didn't kill, I'm afraid the insects took care of also. You had a real big problem with grasshoppers eating what was left of the crops. Some reports of as many as 5,000 people died because of the heat, so just an enormous impact.
You combine all those things together and you're going to have a dust bowl.
In 1620, when the Pilgrims set sail from England at the height of the Atlantic hurricane season, bound for the existing Jamestown, Virginia colony, the 54-day journey of the Mayflower nearly ended in catastrophe. The tiny ship skirted the edges of a huge storm and was forced to land hundreds of miles to the north in what is now Massachusetts.
They passed to the north of a relatively large tropical storm.
Eventually they made their way to Provincetown and then Plymouth, all due to the whims of weather.
They were very happy to land anywhere they could after that journey in that little ship.
Forced by weather to settle apart from Jamestown, the Mayflower Pilgrims, influenced by their Puritan religious experience, envisioned a new kind of colony.
You started getting at Plymouth the idea that you weren't just coming here to exploit or take from the bounty from the land, but you were coming here to build a new kind of civil society.
They all got together and they decided the rules by which they would live.
In the absence of direct English governance, the Pilgrims drew up the Mayflower Compact, a document hailed as a precursor to the Constitution. By signing this covenant, they agreed that civil authority would derive from consent of the people. This was but the first of several uniquely American values that took root in Plymouth.
Communities that had religious tolerance and where you had a value system that was supreme compared to Europe.
Even a cursory reading of history reminds you of how often the unpredictable variations of nature affect the course of human history.
Where people sometimes settle is often where their ship landed.
When a Category 3 hurricane known as the Bola cyclone roared up the Bay of Bengal in November of 1970, it became the deadliest storm in modern history.
The death toll was close to unimaginable.
Bangladesh lost 300,000. Some estimates are 500,000 people perished, drowned in the storm surge from an extreme cyclone that hit them.
Very low-lying areas on the coastline where a lot of people live. Just tremendous loss of life.
They'll never know for sure how many people actually died in that tropical cyclone, but it was a huge loss of life.
Now, what happened, unfortunately, was that the country of Pakistan was unable to really get massive aid into that region quickly.
They did blame the government for not taking care of the folks in Bangladesh.
A 2-decade-long East Pakistani rebel movement challenging West Pakistan's oppressive military rule was brought to a boiling point in February of 1971. After a brutal 9-month war in which 3 million Bengalis died, West Pakistan surrendered on December 16th, and a new nation was born.
East Pakistan became Bangladesh's own separate country, and one of the fundamental reasons for that was the lack of response for their own people in that area by the government of Pakistan at the time.
You tend not to think of natural events like storms as something that would necessarily completely change the political structure of the world, but in that particular case, it did.
In 1984, Ethiopia was in the throes of a long drought that had reached epic proportions.
84 is a situation where everything bad came together at the same time.
Ethiopia really caught the worst of it, but it impacted tens of millions of people.
Just created a devastating famine. People ran out of food, and many, many lives were lost.
The horrific images of the starving masses touched the heart of an Irish musician named Bob Geldof. To raise relief funds for the largely ignored weather catastrophe, he put together the biggest live concert in the history of the world on July 13th, 1985.
Will you please welcome America to Live Aid Day?
greatest concerts. Everybody tuned in just to watch the concert.
And something that was from the heart by the entire music community. And it impacted people everywhere.
Live Aid brought it home to everybody in the world.
Well, I was part of Live Aid, and it took the creative community to shame the rest of the world into recognizing a natural disaster that should have been pursued by governments and not artists.
Knighted by the Queen in 1986, Sir Bob Geldof and Live Aid raised over $283 million. Geldof's tireless efforts continue to this day to raise additional millions for long-term development and drought relief in Africa.
Water is life in Africa, and that's really the bottom line.
Still ahead on this hour of the 100 biggest weather moments.
Men's fortunes rise and fall based on whether the clouds come or go.
Welcome back to the 100 biggest weather moments. Throughout this countdown, we've seen instances of how crucial the weather can be to success or failure in military operations. In our next moment, we see this again in what may be its most dramatic and devastating form. How something as simple as a temporary break in the clouds sealed the fate of an entire city in one of the 20th century's defining moments.
Men's fortunes rise and fall based on whether the clouds come or go.
Seldom has the weather had a more direct and disastrous impact on the lives of hundreds of thousands of people than on August 9, 1945, over the skies of Japan. 25-year-old pilot Charles Sweeney was flying an atomic bomb, codenamed Fat Man, to its target, Kokura, Japan, just 3 days after the U.S. dropped the first atomic bomb over Hiroshima. However, a storm front had separated him from his escorts.
When he got over Japan, he waited for an hour for his escorts to meet him over their designated meeting point. And in that time that was lost, their primary target, which was Kokura, was obscured by cloud.
3 times they pass over the city of Kokura, and the clouds are totally obscuring the city.
You always have an alternate target, a secondary target. And Nagasaki was the secondary target.
So they go over to Nagasaki, and there they find the same situation, cloud cover, conditions very unfavorable for visual bombing.
And their orders had been to bring the atomic bomb back home and land with it.
With fuel running dangerously low and the crew nervous about landing with an armed atomic bomb, suddenly the clouds parted over Nagasaki.
The bombardier calls out on his radio, I have a visual. There's a hole that's opened up in the clouds.
He found an aim point, and they were able to drop the bomb.
The death toll in Nagasaki, a seaport of about 200,000 residents, was estimated at 70,000, with an additional 75,000 seriously wounded, all mainly civilians. Radiation effects would claim thousands more over time. 6 days later, Japan announced total surrender to the Allied powers, officially ending World War II.
It was weather that made the final call and sealed the fate of the inhabitants of Nagasaki.
That's all the time for this hour, but coming up in our top 12 biggest weather moments, a shocking kite flight, a heartbreaking hurricane, and the most crucial weather report in history. We'll see you then.
I was always enamored with weather, but never went into it as an initial career. And I should have gotten an idea of that on my honeymoon, because on my honeymoon we go to Florida and end up 2 days after my honeymoon begins in a hurricane. My first time in Florida, my first time with a hurricane, first time where the earth moved, the glasses broke, and the windows came in, and it was all because of a hurricane on my honeymoon.